Okay, so welcome to the deep dive where we kind of like dig into all the stuff you guys send us and try to pull out like the real nuggets of gold, you know. And today we're going to be diving into, well, it's kind of a wild combo. Something called PRS that stands for polygenic risk scores, which is a mouthful, and then this idea of Asabiya. And Asabiya basically is like this super intense social glue think, like hardcore group loyalty, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, what's cool is a lot of what we're looking at comes from like blog posts and the comments people left on them, which is always fun because you get so many different opinions and perspectives.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do today is, well, first we're going to try to make sense of what these concepts even are, then see if our sources kind of hint at how they might be connected and like what it all means in the grand scheme of things. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Totally. So let's start with this PRS thing.
Okay, so when you look at that first blog post, it seems like a polygenic risk score is all about prediction. You could almost think of it like predicting the weather, you know? Like meteorologists look at a ton of different factors to tell you if it's going to rain, but it's always a probability, not like 100% guarantee. Well, PRS does something similar, but instead of weather, it's looking at your genes. And instead of rain, it's trying to predict if you're likely to have a certain trait, like a personality trait or, you know, something like that. But again, it's about likelihood, not a definite yes or no. It basically takes your entire genetic code, all those genes, and uses them to create a score.
Okay, so I get that it's about prediction, but like what really jumped out at me when I was reading this blog post was the author's initial thought about like how this PRS thing could be used. And it was kind of mind blowing, honestly. They were saying it could lead to tests that are like way harder to fake than the stuff we have now. You know, like take IQ tests, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can totally study for those, right?
Yeah.
And personality tests too. It's like you can kind of figure out what they're looking for and try to game the system. You know what I mean? We've all done it, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But what the blog author was getting at was like with your genes, and this is where it gets super interesting. As long as like the genetic test itself is legit, there's just no way for someone to mess with their PRS score.
Yeah.
You can't cheat your genes, basically. It's not about how you act or what you say, but about something that's like built into your DNA.
Yeah.
Which brings up some really big questions about, you know, is it fair to use this kind of information? And like, what does it even mean to be good at something if your genes are basically calling the shots?
Yeah, it gets into some deep philosophical stuff. But from a purely practical standpoint, that whole idea of stability, at least when it comes to like testing and stuff, it kind of makes PRS super attractive in situations where you really need data that's objective and, you know, can't be messed with.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And then the blog author goes on to suggest this first use case. And this is where I was like, whoa, hold on a second. They're talking about companies. Like maybe even when they're hiring people, using PRS to figure out things like Asabiyyah, which is that group loyalty thing we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So like imagine if you could figure out who's naturally inclined to be like super loyal and a team player, right? Then you could build these awesome teams, you know, with way less drama and backstabbing and more people just focus on the group's goals. It's a pretty crazy idea, but it makes you think, right?
Yeah.
I mean, can you really boil down something as complex as loyalty to your genes? Like, are there specific loyalty genes, or is it way more complicated than that?
I mean, it definitely opens up some interesting possibilities. And yeah, there are some ethical questions there, which we can definitely dig into later. But I mean, building on that whole idea and giving us a bit of a sneak peek into the future, the comment section on this blog post really got into the like practical side of things. Some people were mentioning that there are actually already some PRS tests available right now. And then there was this whole discussion about how as technology gets better, you know, like whole exome sequencing and whole genome sequencing, all that stuff, as it gets cheaper and easier to do, these PRS scores could become way more accurate and cover a much wider range of traits. Kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah, it is. It makes you realize this isn't just some science fiction concept. It's happening now.
Mm-hmm.
And the comments really blew my mind with all the different ways people were thinking about using this stuff. Like one person was talking about how NBA teams could use PRS to predict how tall players will be, which, I mean, makes sense in a way, right? Height is a pretty big deal in basketball.
It makes sense to me.
Right. But then it gets even weirder, and people are talking about, like, what if genetic screening becomes a routine thing when you're applying for jobs? Whoa, right? Like, imagine that. But then think about it. If everyone starts trying to select for certain traits Wouldn't that actually change the future of those traits in the population?
For sure. It's like you create these feedback loops that can lead to like huge societal shifts, right? You can see the commenters really grappling with this stuff. Like, what happens in a world where your genes basically determine your entire life? And, like, your job, your career, everything's decided by your DNA. It's pretty scary, honestly.
Yeah. It is. It's like, does free will even exist anymore? And then there's the super practical problem of actually creating a PRS for these really complex personality traits, right? Like, how do you even measure something like honesty in a way that you can then connect it back to specific genes? It seems almost impossible, right?
Yeah.
And one of the commenters brought up this exact point. They were saying that, like, maybe the first PRS test will have to focus on simpler stuff, maybe even starting with demographic data, which is, like, easier to get and work with. But then they went on to talk about, like, future scores predicting if you're going to get divorced or, like, even arrested. And it's just, whoa. It makes you realize how much could potentially be measured with this stuff.
Yeah.
Even if the accuracy and the ethics are still, like, totally up in the air.
Yeah. And that leads to this other question. What can we reliably measure with PRS right now? And the comments actually brought up this distinction between, like, phenotype, which is basically just a fancy word for your observable characteristics, like how you look and act, and genotype, which is your actual genetic makeup, the stuff hidden in your DNA. And the argument in the blog post is that PRS might be valuable because, well, some phenotypes, like how you present yourself in a job interview, are really easy to fake. Right? I mean, you can try to act confident even if you're freaking out inside, but your genotype, the stuff measured by PRS, is much harder to manipulate.
Right. Like you can act a certain way, but your genes might tell a different story. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Although the author of the blog post actually threw in this kind of snarky comment saying that basically interviews are useless anyway. Which, I mean, I don't know if I agree with that, but it's an interesting perspective, right? Like, they're saying relying on observable behavior is a waste of time.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement. Okay, so we've got a decent handle on this whole PRS thing. Let's switch gears now and talk about Asabiyyah. Now, in these blog posts and comments, this concept is introduced through the work of, let me see if I can pronounce this right, Ibn Khaldun. I think that's how you say it. He was like this super smart Islamic scholar, like way back in the 14th century. And from what I understand, Asabiyyah is this like intense form of social solidarity. You know, it's like a really powerful sense of belonging to a group, this feeling of loyalty and supporting each other no matter what. You know, it's the kind of thing you see a lot in like close-knit groups, like tribes or families. And what Ibn Khaldun was saying is that this social glue, it's powerful, but it doesn't last forever. It's like a key part of how societies grow and change over time.
Exactly. And one of the first things that pops up in the comments is this question. Is this Asabiyyah something that can be like passed down through generations? Is it in our genes? And one commenter was wondering, like, maybe the nomadic lifestyle, you know, where you're constantly on the move and you really need to rely on each other to survive, maybe that kind of life favors people who are more genetically predisposed to Asabiyyah, you know, like maybe those genes get passed down more often because they help people survive in that kind of environment. And then they were thinking maybe in more settled, like city life, Asabiyyah isn't as important, so maybe it gets diluted over time, or maybe it fades away as groups mix and intermarry. So it all gets back to that classic debate, right? Nature versus nurture. Is this a biological thing, a cultural thing, or some kind of crazy mix of both?
Man, that debate never goes away, does it?
Yeah.
It's like pops up everywhere. And it's cool because the comments actually offer a bunch of different takes on this, like how long Asabiyyah lasts and what drives it. So one idea that seems to come from Ibn Khaldun himself is that there's this cycle, you know, it lasts about 3 generations. So like the generation that founds the group, they have super strong Asabiyyah. Then their kids, the second generation, they still have it pretty strong because they like knew the founders. But then after that, it starts to weaken, you know, and they give a couple reasons for this. Like in cities, families get bigger and kids are raised differently. They're not exposed to the same kind of challenges and conflicts that the nomads face. So they don't develop that same level of like intense group loyalty. So this explanation makes it seem like it's more about how you're raised than about your genes, right?
Right. But then another commenter jumps in and says, hold on a second. 3 generations could actually be enough for genetic influence to show up, especially if like the conquering group intermarries with the local population, but they still raise their kids with their own cultural practices. So this idea is kind of bringing the gap, right? It's saying that maybe genes and culture both play a role. And then there's this even more nuanced perspective that says, like, maybe we're all born with these genetic predispositions, you know, but they can be turned on or off depending on the environment. It's like, we have these programs for both high trust and low trust societies, and it's the world around us that decides which program gets activated. So it's not just about your genes determining everything, it's about this interaction between your genes and your environment.
Whoa, that's a pretty cool idea. So we're seeing all these potential, like, biological and cultural factors that could be behind Asabiya. Now, let's think about how this plays out on a larger scale, like with the rise and fall of dynasties, like kingdoms and empires. Ibn Khaldun had some interesting thoughts on this. He was saying that strong social cohesion, that Asabiya is like the secret sauce that helps a group rise to power in the first place. Everyone's united, they're working together, they're unstoppable. But then over time, that very cohesion starts to break down. It's like things get too easy. People start looking out for themselves, and eventually the dynasty collapses. And then some new group with that strong Asabiya comes along and takes over. One of the sources even mentioned this idea of like prestige decay happening over 4 generations, which kind of fits with this whole cyclical view of how societies rise and fall.
Yeah, it's like a repeating pattern throughout history. And then things get even more interesting when we try to apply this idea of Asabiya to like bigger, more complex groups like modern nations, right? I mean, can a country of millions of people really have the same kind of intense social glue that you see in a small tribe? And the blog author we were talking about earlier, they're actually pretty skeptical about this idea that large-scale societies are built on, like, ethnic nepotism. They think that maybe in some populations, evolution actually favored more general forms of altruism, where you're willing to help people even if they're not directly related to you.
Okay, so that raises a really big question. Like, how far does our natural tendency to cooperate actually extend? Are we hardwired to help anyone? Or is it mostly about helping our own family, our tribe, our people? The blog author even brought up these historical examples like people turning Turk and, what were those other terms? Medidezers and Quislings, yeah. These were people who, like, sided with the enemy, often against their own ethnic group. And they're using this as evidence that, like, maybe we don't have this super strong genetic drive to always cooperate with our own tribe. And then they compare it to like how hard it is to get people to betray their own family. They're saying that bond is way stronger, way more deeply rooted.
Right. But on the other hand, I mean, think about how powerful national anthems can be, like they can evoke this really strong sense of unity and patriotism. And one of the comments suggested that maybe successful nations have figured out how to tap into those deep psychological mechanisms that we evolved for smaller family-based groups, like think about how countries use terms like fatherland and motherland, or how they talk about citizens being brothers and sisters. It's almost like they're intentionally trying to make the nation feel like a giant family.
Yeah, like they're hijacking our built-in emotional wiring, right? Which evolved for like small groups, and using it to create a sense of belonging to something much bigger. And somebody else in the comments mentioned that really effective organizations like businesses or military units often deliberately try to create these family-like structures, to boost morale and loyalty. Like, think about how the military is organized into like squads and platoons and companies. It's all about creating these tight-knit groups that feel like family.
Totally. And then one of the blog posts actually included this quote from a guy named Walker Connor. He's like this expert on nationalism. And he basically says that while nations aren't necessarily built on like actual shared blood, this perception of a shared origin, a shared history, it's super important for building national identity. Like people need to believe they come from the same place, even if it's just a story, That's what gives them that sense of belonging.
So it's not really about being genetically related to everyone in your country, but it's about believing in that shared story, right? Like we're all in this together. We have the same roots, which really highlights how much of national identity is just a social and cultural construct.
Exactly. And the conversation goes even deeper, with some people drawing a contrast between Asabiya and what they call foolish wide-field altruism, which is basically the idea that, like, to build a successful large-scale republic, you kind of need people to be altruistic in a way that extends way beyond their immediate family and tribe. And this might even seem like counterintuitive from a purely evolutionary standpoint, right?
Yeah.
And then there was this other really provocative argument suggesting that populations with a history of inbreeding might actually be less capable of, like, forming those abstract national level allegiances compared to populations that are more outbred. Which is crazy, right? Like, connecting something as personal as, like, who you choose to marry with the ability to form nation states.
Yeah, it's blowing my mind a little bit. And I think it was the same commenter who also brought us back to Ibn Khaldun's ideas, saying that this whole Asabiyyah thing might actually represent like this constant underlying tension between different tribes and clans, Like they're always competing even if it's subtle, like through favoritism and stuff. And they're arguing that to create a truly unified nation in those kinds of situations, you might need to come up with different political systems. Ones that aren't just based on the winner-takes-all kind of democracy that we see a lot in the West, maybe something more focused on consensus and compromise.
That's a really interesting point. And then to bring it back to the real world, the comments also mention some modern examples of Asabiyyah in action, like Saddam Hussein's Iraq and the Arab Gulf states. Apparently, family and tribal ties still play a huge role in those societies, especially within, like, the military, intelligence agencies, and the ruling families.
Wow, it's fascinating how this ancient concept is still so relevant today, right? Okay, so we've talked about PRS, which is this tool for predicting traits based on your genes, and we've talked about Asabiyyah, this powerful force of social cohesion, especially in kinship groups. Now, the big question is, how do these two things connect based on the stuff you send us?
Right. Well, we have to go back to that initial idea from the blog post,
Yeah.
the one about using PRS to find people who might be naturally high in Asabiyyah, right? The idea was that companies could use this information to build more cohesive, more loyal teams.
Right, the idea of finding the ultimate team players, genetically speaking. But then one of the comments brought up this really important point, like, what if Asabiyyah isn't about an individual's genes, but more about how genetically similar a group is as a whole? Maybe because of inbreeding or, what was it called? Population bottlenecks. The blog author actually disagreed with this, though. They were saying that's not how kin selection works. But it's interesting, right? Like, even within this one blog post and its comments, there's already disagreement about how this whole Asabiyyah thing might work on a genetic level.
Definitely. And then someone else brought up a super practical point. Even if you could accurately identify people with high Asabiyyah, who's to say they'd be loyal to their employer? Like, what if their loyalty is still primarily to their family, their ethnic group, their religion? Hiring them based on Asabiyyah wouldn't guarantee they'd put the company first, right?
Yeah, it's like you might be hiring someone who's incredibly loyal, but loyal to the wrong thing from the company's perspective. And then there's this even bigger concern, which is, like, if companies start hiring based on Asabiyyah, aren't they just going to be, like, extracting this trait from the population without actually giving anything back to the individuals or the groups they belong to? It kind of raises questions about exploitation, and the broader social impact of using this kind of information.
For sure. It brings us back to all those big ethical questions about using PRS in general. Like, it's a powerful tool, but it has the potential to be misused, and we need to be really careful about how we use it.
So to wrap things up, we've taken this deep dive into polygenic risk scores, which are like this potential window into all sorts of traits based on your genes. And we've explored Asabiyyah, this historically powerful form of social glue, especially in groups based on kinship. We've seen how these two concepts might be connected, particularly when it comes to things like organizational behavior. But we've also uncovered a ton of questions, and it's clear that the science is still evolving. We don't have all the answers yet.
Yeah, there's still so much to learn about the complex interplay between our genes, our social structures, and the forces that bring us together or sometimes tear us apart.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. Given the potential for PRS to, actually identify people who might be predisposed to this strong sense of group loyalty, this Asabiyyah thing, and knowing how powerful this force has been throughout history, what do you think would happen if this technology became widespread? Really think about it. What would it mean for individual freedom? How would it change the way societies are organized? And what would it mean for the future of, cooperation and conflict in a world where we can actually measure people's genetic tendencies towards social behavior? It's a lot to ponder, right? We encourage you to, dig into the work of Ibn Khaldun, keep up with the latest research on polygenic risk scores, and just keep thinking about the incredible connection between our genes and the cultures we create. It's a wild ride.